I think, is a plant to draw us into the neutral zone. That way we look like the aggressors.
And the Romulans would have a legitimate excuse for responding in force.
Exactly.
That would also not be an atypical Romulan ploy, sir.
It's always a game of chess with them, isn't it?
I believe the analogy refers to the worst quality of capitalists. The Ferengi are believed to conduct their affairs of commerce on the ancient principle caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware.
One of the more interesting aspects of Star Trek to engage in, when you take all the series into account, is to analyze the intra-quadrant politics and theorize how two different powers might interact. An example of this would be to speculate how a war between the Romulan Star Empire and the Ferengi Alliance might take place. For the purposes of this conversation, we will be looking at a more conventional war between the two. Why the war began isn't as relevant, but if I had to give a reason, it would probably be due to Romulan internal strife and the government wanting to create a boogeyman so that they could stay in power. Due to this, we will assume that the negotiations break down due to the Ferengi being unable to create terms that the Romulans can live with. It is important to know that we are assuming a war early in Deep Space Nine's tenure, at least initially. This would mean probably Season 1 or Season 2 of Deep Space Nine itself. We're doing this since after the Dominion War that would change things drastically. Before we get too far into it, let's take a look at the two belligerents. The Ferengi Alliance is a hyper-capitalistic government that took at least 10,000 years to establish. The handful of planets under the Ferengi sway are considered to have strong business interests with large economic influence. The government is run on the more toxic elements of capitalism, with each position within the government requiring bribery and patronage to sustain yourself. It would take money, either through business or illicit means, to rise in the ranks. That said, this often did create a sort of Darwin-like system where intelligent and conniving Ferengi rose to the top. These quote-unquote smart Ferengi would be able to work within the system and even protect the government from being attacked from outside influences. It is important to know that the Ferengi had always been known to stay neutral during galactic conflicts and often use their influence in trade to convince governments that war wasn't really reasonable. These Ferengi economic pressures would either force the other governments to acquiesce to the requests or allow them to come up with an agreement that everyone could live with. The Ferengi military, such that it is, works more as a local militia with defensive measures used to protect Ferengi trade. The captains of the military, also known as daemons, were more focused on expanding trading opportunities of the Alliance than fighting in any major conflict or war. However, even though the Ferengi didn't often engage in such wars, their technology was often considered to be on par with that of the Federation.
Very impressive design.
Anything on that design, Data?
Nothing specific, sir. As you know, Ferengi technology is estimated to be generally equal to our own.
But that does not mean identical, however.
Correct, sir. We are no doubt advanced in some areas, they in others.
The Decorac-class vessel was known to have parity with the Galaxy-class starship of Starfleet, and was impressive to the crew of the Federation flagship, the USS Enterprise D. The vessel had a forward missile launcher, torpedo launcher, directed energy weapon, and electromagnetic pulse weapon that was able to drain the power and energy from reserve batteries and stores of enemy vessels. The Decorac would also have an auxiliary ship that can be used, though its exact specifications aren't known. The Ferengi also have a supplementary small shuttlecraft, though again the information on said vessel isn't available. The vessel's warp systems were also thought to be about as quick as a Galaxy-class starship, putting it roughly at warp factor 9. On the opposite side, we have the Romulan Star Empire. The Empire is an interstellar government spanning hundreds of worlds. The Romulans are known for extreme secrecy, subterfuge, and territorial expansionism. The Star Empire was considered one of the major powers in the Alpha Quadrant and a major belligerent in the Dominion War. That said, the Romulans rarely engaged in outright conflicts, and they often lost when they did. While their 23rd century counterparts were more like soldiers that would fight outright, the 24th century, where this war occurs, would show Romulans to often work in subterfuge and covert military action. They often attempted to sow discord within a rival government and destroy from within. This rarely worked out as planned for the secret police, otherwise known as the Tal Shiar. Unlike the Ferengi Alliance, the Romulan military was an advanced force that was both spacefaring and had ground forces. They had a dedicated military that was trained to keep war out of their borders and conduct operations in enemy territory. An entire military branch existed for both the military itself as well as civilian counterparts. Among the vessels that would be fielded by the Romulans for this conflict would include the Dex-class starship, as well as the Romulan scout ship. There are older vessels that would be available. This includes the D7-class Romulan bird of prey, the 2399 Romulan warbird, and the Romulan drone ship, but these are outdated models that aren't observed in the 24th century. While the Valdor class is something that exists, we can only see it later in the Dominion War, so it won't be available right now. The Dex is an advanced vessel, though, that is either on par or arguably slightly more powerful than the Galaxy-class equivalent. The ship has a warp capability of 9, but can extend that to 9.6 with damage to the propulsion system. The vessel is only capable of warp 6 while cloaked, though, and that's going to be important in the future. The armaments of the vessel includes disruptor rays, phasers, photon torpedo launchers, and a primary disruptor array. Like the Ferengi shuttles, we don't have a lot of information on the smaller Romulan ships. For the purposes of this conflict, we are assuming that the war will be declared and be conventionally conducted. I've said that already. Analyzing the canon map of the Star Trek universe, thanks Star Trek Picard for finally making something canon, we can identify the edges of Romulan space and put that against the edges of Ferengi space. Looking at the star chart, this appears to roughly be 2,000 light years between the two. I will take a moment to caveat and say there is some dispute on how accurate this map is as presented. Apparently, a member from the podcast and/or game show, A Question of Trek, believes that the map doesn't look like this, but looks more like this. I remain skeptical, but you can go down to the website in the description below to see for yourself and make your own decision. For now, we'll assume the one presented, and has always been considered canon through time up until now, is going to be the one we use. I may come back and look at the more condensed version at some point, but to say the difference in the map is a game changer for the war is putting it lightly. That's a whole new episode. Anyway, all that to say, this will be the map we're using for this video. Analyzing the war itself, the only logical conclusion is that the Ferengi would be fighting a defensive war. It'd be unlikely that any conflict would occur in Romulan space by the Ferengi themselves. Due to this, Romulans would have to gather and send off an invasion fleet. While they could attempt to circle around Federation space, this would likely take a long time. The space is actually in 3 dimensions, so we don't know how far up or down the territory goes. The fastest and easiest way to do this would be to go through Federation space, but that would necessitate the use of cloaking technology. Due to this, Romulan vessels would largely have to travel at warp 6. However, they would not have to stay cloaked the entire time. While there could be Starfleet patrols, the Romulan Armada only needed to utilize cloak when necessary, and travel at warp 9 when it was improbable that they'd run into any interference. We can't be completely sure how much of the time they'd have to stay cloaked, but let's be generous and cut the time in half. At warp 6, from the Romulan border to the Ferengi border would take about 5 years, maybe a little bit over. At warp 9, it would take a little under a year. So cutting that in half, let's call it 2.5 years to get to the Ferengi. With roughly 2 years to prepare for an outright invasion, the Ferengi would begin a build-up of their defenses, but honestly, that wouldn't be their main focus. The Alliance historically are not known for their military prowess. They generally focus on finances at a galactic level and use that to impact politics. As stated, this fight would be a regional war around Ferengi space. Given that reality, their economic might would become an extreme advantage. When looking at the influence of Latinum on various species, it's kind of ironic that the closer you get to Ferenginar, the more of an impact you see. While this makes logical sense, I doubt any writer actually meant to do that. Given the Ferengi's economic power, any war with their loss would result in extreme negative repercussions economically. Additionally, war so near to even neutral outposts will impact trade, even if the fighting isn't happening in that general area. Because of that, the Cardassian Union and Lesepians would be hard-pressed not to come to the aid of the Ferengi Alliance. Additionally, the Bajorans would likely claim neutrality while being sympathetic to the Ferengi. The fighting would be far, far removed, but it's likely that the Zinkethi would share similar sentiments to that of Bajor. Interestingly, dialogue in TNG and early DS9 seem to indicate some form of positive relationship between the Cardassian Union and Breen Empire. While this definitely changes in late Deep Space Nine, we know a Cardassian embassy was established on the Breen homeworld. It is possible that some assets, or at least support, might be given by the Breen as well. The Federation, unsurprisingly, would stay neutral, though the Ferengi are going to most assuredly request continual assistance for quote-unquote humanitarian aid, ensuring Starfleet vessels protect and guard foodstuffs as well as medical supplies on their way to war-torn areas. It's also possible that the Romulans would attempt to negotiate a peace treaty, or even alliance, with the differing regional powers, but again, the Ryansu can't offer much. The only thing they might be able to barter with is possible territorial gains, and that's at the cost of the economy. Even though the Cardassian Union is resource-starved, that's a large ask for something that's trivial in comparison to full economic collapse. Though, interestingly, even with all of these preparations, the arrival of the Romulan invasion force would be devastating to the Ferengi and its allies. With the Ferengi being the most technologically advanced of all of the newly formed alliance, they would still easily be outmaneuvered by soldiers that fly under the Raptor's wing. Initial attacks, even by a weary Romulan armada, would be quick and devastating. A beachhead would be established and, honestly, would be absolutely vital in order for the Romulans to conduct war. The Ryansu are so far away from supply lines, the use of planets for repair and resources can't be understated. When considering how the Romulans might decide to conduct their war and how large the front would be, even though Cardassia and the Lesepians allied with the Ferengi, it's unlikely that the Romulans would attempt to attack their space. This would spread their forces out too far and risk antagonizing the Bajorans, Zenkethi, and Federation. The fighting would be fierce, but assuming the Cardassians utilize some of their military experience, the plan would ultimately be to grind the Romulan advance to a halt and force them to fight a protracted and costly war. Even with some planets now under the control of the Ryansu, they still don't have the facilities to build new vessels or maintain their existing fleet. Conversely, the Ferengi and their allies would be receiving reinforcements almost daily, with vessels being repaired relatively easily. The Romulans also have issues replacing soldiers lost in combat, while the Ferengi and Cardassians have training camps within a hop, skip, and jump of the battle lines. While the Romulans would be reminiscent to admit it, I dare say the Federation's Diplo Corps would be likely starting to place heavy pressure upon them. In all of this, we haven't even talked about one of the key aspects that is a major player as well, and that's the Tal Shiar. It is possible, with smart Romulans, that the Tal Shiar worked to overthrow and turn the Ferengi Alliance into a puppet state long before actual combat occurs. They would, of course, have to do this without being detected by Section 31 and the Obsidian Order, but that's a conversation for another time. For this scenario, as I've discussed, we've assumed that outright war occurs, but that doesn't mean that the Tal Shiar isn't working in the background. It is possible that they would attempt to cause discord within the Alliance as well as impact the politics of Ferenginar. Additionally, the Ferengi and their allies would likely see an increase in sabotage to their ships and facilities. A few things to consider before this is called a curb stomp, though. First, the Tal Shiar has to directly compete against the Obsidian Order within this entire scenario. While dialogue tells us the Obsidian Order is much more dangerous than the Tal Shiar, we don't really see that in the series. However, the Obsidian Order would still likely provide excellent counterintelligence along with inflicting massive damage. Remember, the Romulans would be working on conquered planets. A lot of the people might not like that, and would be open to the Obsidian Order helping them cause some strife. There's also another X factor. That is to specifically talk about Section 31. The organization probably wouldn't resist any chance to weaken the Star Empire. The net benefits are almost incalculable here. It could mean assisting the Ferengi in the war directly or conducting extensive operations within the Romulan Star Empire's borders. This would be a lot easier since they'd be in a weakened space and focused on the Ferengi-Romulan War. However, all of this wouldn't be the deciding factor of who wins in the Ferengi-Romulan War. And no matter what, I dare say the Romulans are going to win. The saviors of the Ferengi would come not from the Cardassians, not even from the Federation, but the Klingon Empire. Make no mistake, the Klingons absolutely hate the Ferengi, but they also are pretty opportunistic and hate the Romulans just as much. They would see the attack on the Ferengi to be without honor. Romulans don't have that apparently, no matter what they do. And it is likely that Klingon assets would begin raids, if not a full-out assault, on Romulan outposts across their border. This now opens up two fronts for the Romulans. And it would be at that point that a Ferengi rule of acquisition would come into play. Specifically, the rule of acquisition number 3. Never spend more for an acquisition then you have to. Right now, during this conflict, everything leading up to this point, peace was at a bargain. The Romulans certainly were going to win the war, but at a heavy cost. And both sides had weapons. The Ferengis had weapons, the Romulans had weapons, but no one was going to win the war decisively without a lot of cost. Again, peace had never been so cheap. And that's when the Ferengi, in my opinion, would use their greatest advantage: negotiation. While it's anyone's guess, if I was writing it, I would say that the Ferengi would likely cede a planet or two to the Romulans, giving them a foothold in Ferengi space and a clear win for their populace. However, this would likely come at some requirements. For instance, perhaps the requirement that these planets continue to utilize Latinum, and the widespread introduction of Latinum into Romulan Star Empire economics, creating trade routes and a reliance on the currency. After all, if the Ferengi could just get a McDonald's into Romulan space, they'd never have war again. Ultimately, the Ferengi-Romulan War would result in a Romulan victory. No surprise there, but it would come at a cost and likely set up the Ferengi to have new ventures and business opportunities. It might also result in land being lost to the Klingons when they became involved in the war. It is hard to tell what actually would have happened, but it's a fun scenario, if not unlikely. All of these are just my thoughts, though. What are yours? Don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next Lore Reloaded.